Greetings my chess friends, and once again welcome to this chess video. And in it we're going to discuss some chess strategy, particularly strategy concerning the center of the chessboard. And when we talk of the center, we obviously mean these four squares here: d4, e4, d5 and e5. There's also an extended center. Whoops. These squares here, and we call this an extended center simply because when pieces are put in the extended center, then they influence the small center on d4, e4, d5 and e5. Now, why is the center so important? Well, there are three reasons essentially. Firstly, pieces standing in the center control a maximum number of squares and have maximum mobility. Secondly, pieces can be transferred easier and faster to any flank if their help is required because of standing in the center. And thirdly, if you're in possession of the center, the opponent's forces are in most cases disconnected or limited in their fighting efficiency, and they will struggle to get ascendancy. So this is a reason why the center, or the reasons rather why the center is most important. Now, I like to think of the center as being like the pinnacle on top of a mountain. If I'm playing with white pieces, I imagine that these are the top of the mountain and I'm looking down into a valley below where my opponent's forces are being deployed. And the center is like that. He who holds the high ground is at a strategic advantage. And there are essentially two basic ways we can struggle for control of the center. We can put pawns in the center and protect those pawns, or we can let our opponent have the center, have the high ground, and then later undermine the center. And this came to be known as the hypermodern approach as opposed to a classical approach. So we're not going to consider any variations, we're simply going to look at ways that the struggle for the center is carried out. Let's take a look at this little chess diagram. I've isolated the pieces and the pawns, and we can see that white has captured the center. He's captured the high ground on d4 and e4, and he is prepared to support these advanced pawns with his pieces. So there's pawn support and the support by pieces for the center. And this is the idea of having a pawn center. We build a pawn center and we support it with our pieces. Here's another example of a pawn center and how we support it. We can see that the queen and the rook and the dark square bishop all lend support to the c5 point, and of course the bishop and this rook here help support the d5 point. And such a pawn center cramps the enemy's position and limits the mobility of his pieces, and it can also provide a cover for the maneuvers of our own pieces, and some flank offensives and preparations can be made behind such a pawn center. So these are two examples of building a pawn center, supporting it, and why of course it's important for us to do so. In this instance, what you see is the creation of a piece pawn center, where the central squares are not only controlled by pawns, but in addition to pawns, they are also occupied by light pieces. And to be strong, these squares must be supported by pawns or other pieces. And it's very important that these pieces cannot be easily banished from these central squares. And the best square, of course, for such a setup is a square that cannot be attacked by the opponent's pawns. And this we call, of course, an outpost. And if such a square is occupied by a knight or a bishop, it becomes something of great strategic meaning, and our opponent's pieces are cramped because of this, and they can be banished easily as a result. And many tactics, of course, and other ideas arise simply when we manage to occupy an outpost like this. So it's of great strategic value to do so, and this little example highlights that. Here, of course, is another example of a piece pawn center, and this time a bishop has managed to lodge itself into a center square supported by pieces and pawns, and it radiates itself throughout the chessboard. A very powerful piece as a result of this. Now, it must be noted that heavy pieces, for example, sometimes rooks and queens, etc., don't always make good candidates for outposts, simply because they can be chased away by pawns and by light pieces. And these pieces are more suitable, as you can see in this instance, for the control, or to improve the control over the center, as you can see in this diagram. So these are types of centers: the pawn center and what we call the piece pawn center, or the outpost, and they have great strategic value. And this brings us to the idea of undermining a center. Here we can see that white has allowed black to build a pawn center, but he can proceed to undermine this center with the move c4, attacking the pawn on d5 and c6. And this is generally the most effective way of undermining, irrespective of the type of center that the opponent has created, pawn or piece pawn, simply because the goal of undermining is to exchange the enemy's central pawns and chase his pieces away. And as a rule, good undermining results in us getting new possibilities in the center for ourselves. For example, if this pawn advances, we can see that we get control of the e4 square. If the pawn takes, we can see that we have created a weakness, and again we have control of the e4 square. So we get advantages when we undermine a pawn center: more space for our bishop, an open file for our rook, and new weaknesses in our opponent's camp, and sometimes outposts for our pieces. So this is the goal of undermining, and when our opponent has built a pawn center, then we sincerely need to challenge it in some way, and the most effective way of doing that is to undermine it. Here is another example of undermining, where black this time challenges the center and undermines white's control of the center. Now, because it's a fork, white is essentially forced to take, and black advances his knight, and he has created a weakness here on e4. So successful undermining in this instance has resulted in success, and once again I repeat it: if your opponent has a pawn center, you need to challenge it and use this technique of undermining in order to struggle for the center. Now what if you cannot challenge an opponent's piece that is lodged itself in your territory by a pawn advance? Well, what we do is we attempt to exchange off these active pieces for a passive piece, and this is the case here in this little diagram here. White will play the move bishop to e3, threatening to swap off this knight on d4. It was passive on its home square. It is now activated into the game, and it will exchange itself off for this passive piece on d4. And this is what we do. If we cannot chase it away with a pawn, we exchange it off with a passive piece, neutralizing its effect in our territory. And here is another example of that. White has a strong knight here on e5, and we'd love to exchange it off, and we do, of course, bring our own knight into the game, a formerly passive piece, and we use this to threaten to exchange off the strong knight on e5. Here is another instance of piling the pressure on the center. We can see that black has played the move c5, undermining the center. White has sought to defend the center. He has 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces defending, and here black has piled on the pressure. He's doubled rooks, he's attacking with knight, bishop and pawn, and really piling the pressure on white's center, and I don't think it can stand. So this is what we do. Once again, if we cannot exchange pieces or chase them away, we simply seek to increase the pressure on the center by building up pressure. Okay, let us check out how these principles that we've learned with regard to the center work out in practice. And we'll consider a game from 1911 played in Karlsbad between Paul Saladin Leonhardt with the white pieces and Ivor Byrne, or in some instances I think he's called Amos Byrne, with the black pieces. So white begins with e4, putting a pawn in the center, capturing of course the e4 square and putting pressure on d5 and f5. Black replies in kind with e5, knight f3 is played, knight c6, bishop c4 and bishop c5. And we can see that both players have developed their pieces so that they have an effect on the center. c3. The white's idea is simply to challenge black's central control, especially the point on e5. Black anchors the point in e5 with d6, and here white plays his idea of d4. And essentially black is forced almost to take this pawn because the pawn on d4 forks the bishop and pawn. So he plays e takes d and c takes d4. Now what has effectively transpired is that white has managed to exchange a flank pawn that was a c pawn for black's central pawn that was an e pawn, and he is building this strong pawn center. And we can see how it has diminished black's control of the center. There's no longer a pawn on e5, and of course this diminishes black's influence in the center some. The bishop goes in this instance to b6, knight c3, and everything is going well for white. He's developing his pieces in the large center where they have influence, of course, in the small center. Knight f6, white castles, black castles. And in this instance, bishop b3 was played, and it was done solely for the reason that black could have took here on e4, and after the knight takes back, black could have played his pawn to d5, where of course it would fork the bishop and the knight on c4 and e4. And of course this would have profound consequences for white's centre, so for this reason white retreats the bishop to b3. Bishop g4 was played, putting some pressure on the d4 point, therefore white played bishop to e3, h6 and queen d3. And we can see that white's opening strategy has essentially been crowned with success. The centre is firmly in his hands, and under the cover of this pawn centre he's going to prepare a decisive offensive. And we can see that white controls all of these squares, and what it in effect means is that black's pieces have limited mobility. These knights, for example, have no outposts in the centre that they can occupy and harass white's position. Rook e8 was played, and here white played knight to d2. Of course he was not afraid of a move like bishop takes f3, because after g takes f3 we'd simply have this open g file for his rook, where he could pressure black's kingside. So white played the inventive here, knight to d2. Queen e7 was played, and rook came to the e file. Rook a to d8, and we can see how the rooks, both black's rooks and white's rooks, are indirectly influencing the centre. a3 was played, keeping the knight out of harassing the queen, and the queen went to f8, exposing the power of this rook. And here white plays the excellent f4, and his idea is simply to play e5, but not only that, he threatens to, of course, to trap this bishop with a move like, for example, f5 and maybe h3 and something like g4, and this bishop would effectively be trapped. Anyhow, the bishop is forced to go home to c8, and white plays h3, and we can see that he is preparing a strong kingside offensive, and it's absolutely quite amazing to see the power of this pawn centre and how it vanquishes black's pieces. King a8, king h8 was played by black, and g4. And look at the awesomeness of this huge pawn centre. It's absolutely formidable. And black's position is going to become more and more cramped. Knight e7, king h1, d5. Now ask yourself the question, would you take this pawn perhaps with e takes d5? Of course the answer is no, simply because if you take this pawn, what it does, it gives black a square in the centre for his knights. And why would we give black an advantage like that? So this late attempt at counterplay is absolutely thwarted by white, and he plays the excellent e5, and he's going to give black nothing in the centre. Knight h7 was played, f5, f6, e6, c6, and white played bishop to f4. Now the idea of this is simply to take charge of this diagonal here and limit the mobility of this bishop here on b6. Knight g8 was played. Knight e4, harassing the bishop. Bishop a5, bishop c2, and queen to e7. Queen to g3, and of course the black bishop will not be allowed to retreat to the c7 square. Black tried b5, but of course it simply pushes this knight to the excellent outpost on c5. Bishop b6, and white cements this knight in on c5 with b4. Knight f8 was tried. And here black played the excellent a4, trying to open up lines for his rooks. a5 was played. Knight d to b3. B takes a4. And now knight takes a5. Bishop takes c5. And here white plays the excellent intermezzo, knight takes c6, tempoing the queen, which otherwise would be forced to move. And in despair, black plays bishop takes d4, knight takes e7, rook takes e7 was played, bishop to c7, bishop to e5, rook takes e5, rook takes c7 was played, rook takes d5, bishop b7, pinning the rook to the king, queen takes e7, bishop takes d5 was played, king g1, rook e8, bishop takes a4, rook e7, queen b8, knight h7, and rook d1. Rook b7, trying to tempo the queen. And here white plays the excellent queen takes b7, the shortest and most direct way to victory, simply because after bishop takes b7, rook to d8, and there is nothing on heaven and earth which can stop this pawn from promoting. So this game really highlighted the effect of having a formidable pawn centre, maintaining the centre and building upon that centre. And what it does is, as we have seen, it limits the opponent's possibilities, limits their mobility, and under the protection of such a pawn centre we can carry out manoeuvres with our own pieces. So hopefully I illustrated these concepts well, and what we'll do now is we'll take a quick look at another game which highlights the importance of building a piece pawn centre. Okay, let us take a look at this example game between Vladimir Grigorovich and Mikhail Botvinnik, played in Moscow in 1931 and the Moscow Championships. And note the amazing way Botvinnik with the black pieces builds a piece pawn centre. Grigorovich plays c4, c5. We'll just quickly go through the opening moves, they're fairly well known. Here Botvinnik is the first to challenge the centre with the move d5. So he takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop g2, and here the knight goes back to the unusual but rather excellent c7, and the knight in conjunction with the queen, of course, have an influence on the d5 square. Knight f3 was played. Knight c6. White castles. e5. This is a typical Botvinnik move, and if you play the English opening and the Botvinnik variation, you will recognise this. And Botvinnik's idea is simply to build an almost impenetrable pawn phalanxes along these diagonals, and to use this square d4 as an outpost for his pieces. So not only are the pawns supporting the centre, but the light pieces will be used at this outpost, supported by pawns, to put great pressure on white's centre. So e5 getting an iron grip on the d4 square. b3 was played. Bishop e7. Bishop b2. Black castled. Rook c1. Taking advantage of the half open c file. And Botvinnik plays f6. Notice how this knight here is almost completely shut out of the game. Knight to e1 was tried, perhaps because of that reason, but again it's a fairly passive retreat. Bishop comes to f5, where again it influences the centre, and knight to a4 was played, trying to hassle the pawn on c5. Well, Botvinnik defended with knight to a6. White tried to put more pressure on c5, and Botvinnik played queen a5, and we can see how the heavy pieces as well as the light pieces are being used to support the centre. It's actually a very instructive game indeed. Knight to c2 was played. Rook f to d8. Knight e3. And bishop went back to e6. And here Grigorovich played d3, which is considered a mistake. It would have perhaps been better for him simply to try to exchange off this knight, and after its recapture trying to play against the weaknesses along the c file. Rook a to c8 was played. Of course, you don't give Botvinnik two chances. Knight to c4 was played. The queen went to c7. Knight d2. Notice how that somehow white is struggling for moves here in this position. b6. Bishop b2. Bishop comes back to the long diagonal. Queen d7. Rook e1, and eventually the culmination of black's strategy. A light piece comes to the d4 outpost. Supported by pawns, it is a formidable piece. And imagine this as being like a mountain, and this is the top of the mountain, and you have the top of the mountain, and you're able to look down into your opponent's position. Well, this is effectively what has transpired. And throughout the game, notice how this d4 square is used to put pressure on and to cramp white's position. Knight c3 was tried, and knight b4. And here Botvinnik himself writes, black has reached an ideal piece and pawn disposition. His knights are located almost inaccessibly, because a move like a3 or a move like e3 would weaken white's position in a fatal way. Anyhow, knight f3 was tried, and here Botvinnik played that amazing knight takes a2, knight takes d4, knight takes c3, rook takes c3, and c takes d4, and now the d4 square is occupied by a pawn, and we can see how it has a cramping effect on white's position. Rook takes c8, rook takes c8, the rook is now in possession of the only open file. e3, this is essentially a kind of weakening move. Bishop b4 was played, hitting the rook, rook e2, bishop c3, e takes d4, bishop takes, rook takes, and now the d4 square is being occupied by the queen. Rook a2, a5, rook a4, queen c3, white tried rook h4, and here after queen c1 white resigned. And we can see that during the entire game, in fact, because black had such a strong centre, not only was his pawns placed in the centre, but these pawns supported light pieces which could be used to cramp white's position, and white really struggled for moves during the entire game because his pieces could not find good squares in the centre. So this is a very instructive game by Botvinnik, and I hope you can of course use these ideas in your own games, and I really sincerely wish you well with your own chess.